What's up guys, this is the theory module for facing river c-bets in position. Basic idea is we are the cold caller, or it could be that we've called against a pre-flop 3-bet. We're in position, and our opponent proceeds to fire a triple barrel while out of position. Now this is a somewhat interesting spot, just because it's different from when our opponent triple barrels in position. And the main difference occurs when we have a look at the bluff to value ratio on the river. The first key takeaway here is that the average villain triple barrel bluffs much more aggressively out of position than they do in position. Now we could speculate what the reasons are for that. Could be something to do with the fact that when someone is in position, they prefer to just take a showdown, whereas when they're out of position, they don't want to check and then face a bet. We could speculate, but it doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is that our opponents do bluff more often when they're out of position and fire a triple barrel line, and that's something that we can exploit. So, villains triple barrel wider OP than in position. So that's important for us being in position, because we can bluff catch wider. Now let's just think slightly about the history behind this line. The original / easy version of how to defend against a triple barrel is basically not to call one pair holdings. And this is not a bad way to start out with the game. If someone was completely new to poker and they wanted to optimize their win rate as fast as possible, one shortcut might just be to not call one pair ever when facing a triple barrel. So our opponent triple barrels, we look down at our whole cards, we need at least 2 pair in order to call against a triple. If we have an overpair, we have top pair to kicker, we can fold that hand. Now, although that's an okay starting point, that is not actually how poker is supposed to be played, and it's not the most profitable way to play on the river in position when facing a triple barrel. And that's because that calling range that we've just described, 2 pair plus, is basically a calling range that only beats some portion of our opponent's value range. In other words, it doesn't actually have any bluff catches. And a correct strategy is always going to involve having some hands that we classify as bluff catchers. So hands that don't actually beat any of our opponent's value range, but should still call anyway because they are going to win if our opponent is bluffing. And this is especially true given that our opponent is out of position. We've just said that they're going to triple barrel bluff wider in the spot. We're going to have opportunities in position on the river to call a triple barrel with a bluff catcher. Now, in this context, when we say bluff catcher in the context of facing a triple barrel, we're basically talking about top pair type hands. Sometimes we might be talking about mid pair type hands. In fact, from a GTO point of view, we're really talking about any pair. But for the most part, when we talk about bluff catcher in this context, we're talking about a top pair type hand that's weaker than top pair to kicker. So these are the kind of hands that don't really win against our opponent's value betting range, but are potentially going to be strong enough to bluff catch. Now, if we just think about this from a theory point of view, how does this usually look? If you imagine we're running a GTO solve, for example, and we're looking at the situation where someone's just triple barreled OOP, what does the bluff catching range of the in position player look like? Well, this is something you can do for yourself. You can run a solve, and what you'll find is there's a surprising amount of pairs. Not just top pairs, but also a whole bunch of mid pairs. In fact, because theoretical bluff catching is really a lot to do with the blocking effect, we'll see that there might be some top pair type hands that actually get folded against a triple barrel, but there's a whole bunch of mid pairs that do defend, and there's even maybe some bottom pairs that are actually just calling down against a triple barrel. So in GTO poker, you could be in a situation where you're calling down with some mid pairs and maybe even a few combos of bottom pair, but then there are some very specific top pair combos that are actually going to be folding against a triple barrel. Now, we don't care so much about blocking effects, and that's to do with the fact that the population is not necessarily betting a perfectly polarized range in the river. They're going to have these mid-strength hands that they're not supposed to show up with when they triple barrel. And what that means for us is that we don't really care as much about blocking effects. We actually care more about the absolute strength of our holding. So the way we approach bluff catching on the river is that it wouldn't make sense for us to fold some top pair type hands and then bluff catch with some mid pair type hands, because top pair is stronger than mid pair. If we can't defend top pair in a certain spot, then we definitely can't defend mid pair. So we approach bluff catching more from an absolute hand strength point of view. And we draw a concrete line. We don't really think too much about blockers. We just say, okay, in this spot I can call all top pairs, but I can't maybe call any mid pairs, for example. There's not going to be a mixture of some top pairs and some mid pairs while we're still folding some top pairs. But just in case you're curious, that is how GTO works. There's actually a bunch of weaker pairs that are going to be bluff catching. Now what this can tell us is if we're to follow this original / easy version of the strategy where we're only calling with 2 pair and better, maybe occasionally stuff like top pair, top kicker, we're going to end up with very high fold to river triple barrel frequencies. In fact, our fold to river c-bet stat in position is going to be something like 60%. Maybe even higher than 60%. We've definitely had some guys passing through the academy who have had things like 70% plus fold to river c-bet. Sometimes it's been a bit of a mystery exactly how it got that high, but the point is, it's going to be high. If we fold all 1 pair type hands facing a triple barrel, we're technically going to be folding exploitably often. If our opponent sees that we fold 70 or even 60% of the time to a triple barrel when we're in position, our opponent should pretty much always bluff the river out of position if they're in a triple barrel scenario, because we're not defending ourselves. Now, in order to defend ourselves, that's when we start following a strategy that's a little bit closer to GTO. And we're not necessarily saying we want to play GTO here, by the way, we're just saying this is what it would look like. We have to start calling with a wider selection of 1 pair type hands. We're going to have to think about using some of those bluff catches, which we've said in this context, they're going to be things like top pair type holdings. In other words, if we never call stuff like top pair, even things like top pair weak kicker, and if we never sometimes even call as wide as mid pair facing a triple barrel, we're technically going to be folding too much. We're going to be exploitable. So more GTO fold to river triple barrel. Okay, it's going to be above 40%, but it might not be above 50%. So if you're wondering what is the difference between someone who folds 60 or 65% of the time to triple barrel versus someone who's only folding 45 to 50% of the time versus triple barrel, it's that second person has bluff catchers in the defending range to have things like top pair and mid pair type hands. Let's think about how we can apply this practically to the games that we're going to be playing in. So when we say practically, we're saying we're not really thinking too much about GTO, we're thinking about what is the population actually doing and how can we exploit that. As time has gone on, it does seem that things get a little bit closer to GTO every time we revisit them. And we'll see an example of this when we start thinking about different types of bluff catching range. And the short version is that we want to try really hard not to fold top pair in position facing a triple barrel. So if you're used to the original / easy version, which is never fold, I mean, you can always fold 1 pair and then don't fold 2 pair plus, you're playing too tight in that case. And against most player pools, it is going to be correct to bluff catch with things like top pair weak kicker facing a triple barrel in some situations, and may in some situations be correct to bluff catch as wide as something like a mid pair. There are other spots where the rule still applies, where it's going to be something like 2 pair plus, so we'll discuss how we can differentiate between those in this session. But our goal is to creatively find ways where we can avoid folding top pair type hands, even if the kicker is kind of terrible. That's how we're going to make ourselves tougher to play against, less exploitable, and also boost our win rate in the process. Now, in terms of the most relevant variable for this kind of situation, it is the formation. Why is it the formation? Because in single raise heads up pots, we have this really unique situation. The big blind versus small blind triple barrel. This is a unique zone. We should almost analyze this separately and say, okay, here is general information about facing a triple barrel when we're in position, and then here is information about playing in the big blind versus a small blind triple barrel, because this is like a completely separate area of the game. And the reason for that is bluffing frequencies are much higher when we're facing the small blind. We should hardly ever fold. This is supposed to say top pair, big blind versus small blind triple. Okay, probably incorrect. Standard situation, we're in the big blind, small blind opens, we cold call in position, we flop top pair weak kicker. Our standard game plan in that spot should be to cool down 3 streets. Should not be folding. Now, if you just put that into context, we're facing that third barrel. Maybe it's even not a super good run out. Maybe some draws did actually get there in the river, and we're there with top pair weak kicker, and our opponent's just bet half pot or maybe 65% pot OP on the river. In that situation, we're not going to win the majority of the time when we call. As is very common with a lot of bluff catching situations, we are actually an underdog. We're not saying we're a favorite. We're probably going to end up winning something like 35% of the time. If it's a good run out, we may even win something like 40% of the time when we call a river in that spot. But assuming it's not a great run out, we might win around 35%. We're going to lose 65% of the time in that spot. So one of the things that makes this slightly tougher is that we're going to need a good mindset. And this is why if someone was new to poker and they wanted to know how to plan the river, you might just tell them, well, don't call one pair facing a triple barrel. Because when they play that way, when they only call two pair plus, they're going to be in a situation where most of the time they have 50% plus equity when they call a river. They're going to win the majority of the time when they bluff catch the river. With this strategy, with these weaker hands, these bluff catches, these weak top pairs, these mid pair type hands, we're going to lose the majority of the time. So we need a good mindset. We need that high degree of confidence of what we're doing as plus EV. Now, on a very good run out in this BB versus SB situation, for some of the data I looked at, for example, I had a look at the 200NL Zoom pool. And this is a situation where top pair is a pretty easy call, and on good runouts, second pair type hands definitely get priced into bluff catching in the spot. So that might sound kind of insane if you're used to just being told bluff catch two pair plus. But in this situation, top pair is a standard call, and our bluff catching region in this spot might actually be the best second pair type hands. Okay, so just understand this is a unique zone, and as soon as you start comparing this to other spots where we face a triple barrel, OOP from our opponent, we'll see that we have to bluff catch a bit tighter. So we should consider bluff catching in the BB versus SB situation with mid pair when bluff catching variables are in our favor. So what do we mean by variables? We'll talk about this shortly. That's things like formation, board texture, board run out, opponent type, bet sizing on the river. The other really interesting thing about BB versus SB spot that sets it apart from the other situations where we face a triple barrel is that we might be able to bluff raise by default in some player pools in a big blind versus small blind triple. So imagine we call two in position. We've got something like gut shot, for example. Our plan is to float bet the river, but then our opponent pulls the trigger on the triple barrel. So normally we fold, but if it's a BB versus SB situation, we may actually be able to bluff raise the river. Some player pools are falling almost 60% in this spot. Now, we're not saying that this necessarily has to be a standard line. You don't have to have any kind of bluff raising range on the river, but it's very close. It does appear that some player pools are falling around 57, and I guess depending on the size we use, we may only need 55% folds. You can see pretty slim margin in terms of profitability. Sometimes you might need slightly less than 55. It might be something like 52.5. So we usually say 55 to be safe. So technically, if we have 57, I guess even factoring in rake, the EV of a bluff raise might be slightly better than the EV of a fold. But you can see it's pretty marginal. It's pretty close. Obviously, rake is more expensive when there are lots of chips in the middle, etc. But that's how wide this line is from certain types of players, is that we can actually think about bluff raising against a triple barrel. So let's classify rules for BB versus SB, and then we're going to think about how we're going to tailor those for spots that are not BB versus SB, because like we said, this is unique. Don't fold top pair on average. It's actually very rare. The interesting thing with the data is that even on some of the draw completing runouts, it's just still incorrect to fold top pair in this spot. Okay, that's how overbluffed this line is. It is recommended to run some calibration on your own player pool. You might find that your player pool is an exception. This was based on the Stars 200NL data. We might find that some of the lower limit player pools are going to be less bluffy in this spot, and we're just going to adjust our strategy. Instead of call down any top pair, it might be, okay, call down top pair with a certain kicker upwards. Or it might be, okay, you can call down top pair, but you might fold some of the weaker ones or draw completing runouts and just never bluff catch mid pair. Whereas the way the Stars 200NL reg tables are set up, it's never fold top pair, like ever, pretty much. Unless there's maybe something crazy going on, like a 4 to flush run out, or maybe villains make a huge overbet in the river or something like that. Never fold top pair, and actually bluff catch second pair a decent amount of the time, BB versus SB triple. Okay, so that's how Stars 200L reg is set up. You might want to calibrate it based on your own player pool, but I mean, these are going to be fundamentally true of many player pools, at least from the sense that we don't give a lot of respect to small blind triple barrels when we're in the big blind. Okay, so this is our strategy. Just as a recap, really, don't fold top pair on average in this spot against a triple. Consider bluff catching mid pairs in specific scenarios where the variables are in our favor. We'll talk about those in a bit. Consider bluff raising in certain environments versus certain opponents. So we can actually bluff raise against a triple in this one unique spot, but not really too much in the other spots. Now, how might this be different for a non-small blind situation? So just to recap, and we haven't got onto 3-bet pots really, by the way, we're still talking about single raise pots for now. So versus non-small blind, so this is going to be something like we're on the button and we cold call a cutoff open. Or we're on the button and we cold call a low jack open, i.e. UTG. Or we're in MP and we call a UTG open. So non-small blind situations. We're going to think primarily about button versus cutoff when we say versus non-small blind, because we'll see that when we get to those really early position battles, you know, hijack versus low jack, stuff like that, we're going to find that it's even tighter. There is actually a bit of a progression here towards our opponents bluffing less as we get to the earlier position formations. But there's a big difference between us being in the big blind facing a small blind triple versus us being on the button facing a cutoff triple. That cutoff triple barrel is already much stronger than the small blind triple barrel. So formation has a big impact here. So here we're going to say don't fold top pair to kicker and top pair second kicker on average. So if you're used to the kind of tight conventional advice, you might want to loosen that up a bit. And if you got top pair to kicker, you really want to try and avoid folding that. We are kind of talking about the higher top pairs of kickers. You know, this might not apply if you have top pairs of kicker with a low pair, for example. So we're talking about the slightly higher pairs. Although having said that, and we'll see this a bit later, even if we have a lower pair, it often means our opponent's bluffing more. So maybe we could just say don't fold top pair to kicker and top pair second kicker on average, even if it's a relatively low pair, for example. And a bluff catcher in this sense is going to be expand to other top pair type hands. So in a perfect scenario, we might expand to just calling any top pair, but we probably want to expand to calling mid pairs. Only in the big blind versus small blind spot does that seem like it's ever going to be viable. Here, we're not going to fold top pair, top kicker, or maybe not top pair, second kicker in general. We might be able to expand a bit beyond that if it's a good run out, for example, if it's a bridge run out, or it's a small river sizing from our opponent, or if they're recreational profile and overbluff, that kind of thing. Here, we don't bluff raise, okay? It's not big blind versus small blind situation. We're not going to bluff raise in this spot. Don't bluff raise without a read. We'll talk about how often we need our opponent to fold a bit later, although we did already touch on that. Earlier formations. So these are probably closer to the other formations. Basically, all the positions seem quite different from BB versus SB. So these are pretty similar, just a bit tighter. So we can just tailor the advice. We can just tighten everything up one notch. And this is what you'll do if, for example, you run player pool analysis on your own player pool and you find out that people just don't bluff as much in your player pool with a triple barrel line. Okay, so you might have this as your standard defending range in general. We might say something like don't fold top pair, top kicker / over pairs on average. You can see we've just taken it up one notch. We can now fold top pair, second kicker on average, but we might expand to that if it's a good bluff catching spot. And we might expand to some even weaker kickers than that, but we might not go as far as the previous slide we've just looked at. So depending on your player pool, and there are some, especially lower limit games, there are some nittier lower limit games. I think one thing that I've found is that there are almost two different brands of low limit games. So you get the very nitty ones, like low limit iPoker used to be like this, GG Network's like that right now, where it is low limit poker, but everyone is just like some serious, like 21 VPIP reg or something and not really playing that aggressively. And then you get other types of low limit games, like some of the softer rooms where everyone's just a crazy donk, right? Everyone's just like 50 VPIP, stuff like that. Seems to be quite a bridge between those two different types of games. We definitely can't say that all micro stakes games are the same, for example. So if you're playing in one of those lower limit, nittier environments, it could be that your game plan is going to be a bit closer to that conventional advice where bluff catching quite tight, something like this. So it might be worth running player pool analysis on your pool. If we just think, for example, like about playing versus orange tags, because if you're playing in like one of those low limit environments and it just is very, very nitty. It's like you're playing against a bunch of orange tags. And against orange tags, we are following that classic advice now, which is we can pretty much fold any one pair type hand when an orange tag triples. Even if it's a BB versus small blind situation, if it's an orange tag, it might still be correct to defend 2 pair plus in that spot. Okay, let's recap on our variables for what's a good bluff catching spot and what's not so good. This is very similar to other spots. We don't need to spend too long on this. Hopefully you're already familiar with these concepts because they apply to pretty much every river situation where we're thinking about bluff catching. Recreational profiles bluff wider than reg profiles. Draw bricking runouts allow us to bluff catch wider. Overcard runouts also allow us to bluff catch wider. The lower the texture's high card, the wider we can bluff catch. Now let's just think a little bit more deeply about the 2 lines we've just looked at. So firstly, draw bricking runouts allow us to bluff catch wider. Now let's just think about how that relates to the board texture. Okay, so these are some subtleties now. This doesn't necessarily only apply to triple barrel situations. In order for there to be lots of draws that brick, there needs to be draws present on the texture. So you often find that when the texture is very dry, even if everything bricks by the river, we're not necessarily going to experience a high frequency of triple barrel bluffs. That's just because there weren't that many live draws that bricked because the texture was dry. On the flip side, if you take something like a code red texture, so much stuff has already got there in a code red texture that there are just less natural bluffs that villain can have that you can use as part of a triple barrel line. The sweet spots in the middle, where we have something like a dynamic texture, or maybe like a semi-dry texture where there are clearly a decent amount of draws. And then from that dynamic texture, everything then bricks. So it's that specific flop texture and runout combination that's going to generate the most bluffs. Okay, so even if it's code red, everything bricks, it's not going to be as high as a bluffing frequency. Or it's a dry flop and everything bricks, it's not going to be as high. If it's specifically dynamic, where there's the most available possible draws and then everything bricks, our opponent's now going to have the largest selection of natural bluffs possible in that spot. We are going to encounter the highest bluff to value ratio in that specific texture runout combination. Okay, that's quite an important point. It's going to really allow you to refine your bluff catching ability. Now the other thing we can focus on is kind of similar. So the lower the texture's high card, the wider we can bluff catch. So what we're saying here is that when we defend big blind in position against a small blind open, if the board texture is ace high and our opponent triple barrels, he's not going to be bluffing very much by the time he gets to the river. It's going to be a relatively low bluffing frequency. We probably still have to call down ace high type stuff there, if it's BB versus SB, you know, top pair, we still have to call down those, but we're probably not going to be bluff catching second pair now because the texture wasn't good for us. It's not a variable that's in our favor. Now if you imagine it's a king high texture, now our opponent's bluffing slightly more often with the triple barrel line. His bluff to value ratio is slightly more weighted towards bluffs on the river because the flop texture was king high rather than ace high. When it becomes queen or jack high, bluffing even more. When it's 10 high, bluffing a huge amount now. When it's a texture that's like 7 high or lower, we're going to be experiencing really high bluffing frequencies on the triple barrel. This is why we're saying if we have like a very low top pair, it's probably still very good as a bluff catcher just because us having a low top pair means the board texture is favorable for us in that our opponent's going to be bluffing more often. Whereas if we have a high pair, like a pair of aces for example, well that probably means the flop texture was ace high, which then means we're not going to experience as high of a bluffing frequency or as high of a bluff to value ratio on the river. Now just to go back to the second bullet point, but overcard runouts also allows us to bluff catch wider. So here's the thing that I just wanted to focus on just very briefly, because it can sometimes seem contradictory at first. We're basically saying that if the river card comes down like an ace or a king, then our opponent's going to be bluffing more. But we've just said that the ace is not so good for us, right? We've just said if it's an ace high texture, that means our opponent's not going to bluff the river as much. So you can kind of see again how the texture and the runout combine to create a unique situation. And the way it works is, if there's an ace on the flop and our opponent triple barrels, that's bad for us. If there's no ace on the flop, but the ace comes in the turn and river, now that's good for us. So you might want to think about it for a period of time and just try and understand how it works. I mean, basic idea, I guess, is that if our opponent, let's say, fires a 10 high flop, right? He fires a flop, fires the turn, the river's an ace, and he fires again. He's now actually repping a kind of narrow value range, because either he had something that's so strong that it can value bet despite the fact that the ace gets there on the river, or he was just bluffing to begin with, right? The size of his possible bluffs start to become large compared to the very narrow value range he's repping. Because all of the other stuff, like his, over pairs of jacks, queens, kings, they're not going to value bet the ace high river. So he's repping a much narrower value range now. So you can see when the ace comes on the flop and we're facing a triple barrel, that's bad for us. When the ace comes on the river and we're facing a triple barrel, now that's good for us because our opponent is repping a less credible range of value hands. Once again, we see that bluff to value ratio starts becoming weighted towards bluffs on that kind of situation. So we don't want to just objectively say ace, that's bad. It depends where the ace comes, right? It depends, by the time our opponent's two barrel flop and turn OP, when there's no ace on the board, he probably doesn't have the ace that much, because what is he two barreling that has the ace? So it's hard to give him credit when the ace comes on the river, right? Hopefully you can see how that works. So those are some of the subtleties for the triple barrel line specifically. Sizing, another important variable. So we especially like bluff catching against sizings that are less than 80% pot. If they're larger than 80% pot, we kind of enter this danger zone where we can start to hero fold a lot. Pot size bets, while they can sometimes contain bluffs, are representative of strength. Same with overbets. It's not so much that they're a lot stronger, it's just that we have two factors working against us. So factor number one is, yes, they're slightly stronger when our opponent overbets. Might not be a lot stronger, but it is slightly stronger. But the other factor that works against us is now we get a much worse price in the call. So even if the range of hands that our opponent overbet was exactly the same as the range of hands he bet pot size with, we would still have to bluff catch tighter against the overbet line because we get a worse price against the overbet. Late position formations allow us to bluff catch wider. Okay, so we've covered that. As we'll see when we get onto 3-bet pots, it applies there as well. So let's think about raising range. This is really just as a recap because we've touched on the important points here. Bluff raise if villain is folding more than 55% of the time to a raise. This is just an average. We don't necessarily know how big our opponent's triple barrel is going to be, and therefore we don't necessarily know how much we're going to be raising by. And very often you find in this spot that our raise size is going to be influenced by whether it's an all-in raise or whether it's just a min raise, which is in turn influenced by the SPR. To give an example, it might be in a situation where, let's say we normally make a 2.2x bluff raise on the river. Okay, I mean, I'm sure most of us don't really bluff raise the river in position. I mean, I certainly don't do a lot of bluff raising in the spot. It is specifically BB versus SB where it seems that it might be profitable, and even then it's only going to be just profitable, okay? But this applies to just bluffing rivers in general. The size we pick may be influenced by the SPR. So let's just say we normally, in inverted commas, 2.2x raise the river in position. But in this specific situation, we're quite shallow, and if we raise 2.3x, then we would be all in. Well, we're not going to raise 2.2x and then just leave 3 or 4 big blinds left. That doesn't make sense, right? So you can see the raise size can be determined by some extent to the SPR. So we might normally make it 2.2, but we notice that, well, if we make it 2.5, that's all in. That's cleaner. We're just going to shove all in as a result of the stack size. So you can see we're not necessarily using the same raise size. Besides, 2.2x raise against one river bet sizing does not necessarily produce the same break-even point as a 2.2x raise against a completely different river sizing. So you can see even if we always did a 2.2x multiple, that doesn't tell us how frequently our raise needs to work. So understand this is just an average estimate, and when we check our opponent's fold river triple barrel to raise stat, that will just be an average as well. So we're just working with very rough values here. It needs to be more than 55% of the time. So if you're asking, well, where did that come from? It comes from averages, right? It comes from just running a simple scenario where we face what we consider to be a standard triple barrel sizing. We kind of simulate what a raise might look like, and then we just run the maths, okay? This is roughly what it's going to be. So for opponents folding more than that, we can think about bluff raising. Like we said, BB versus SB, Zoom 200L, reg tables, falling 57% of the time in this spot against a raise. That's also profit. The other spots, and this is one of the reasons why we said they're different, it's not 57, it's like 55 on the dot, which means probably going to lose to rake or something, I guess. And then in the early position formations, it ends up being like 51, 52, stuff like that. So we can see across the formations, there's a range there of well over 5%, maybe even 10% at some player pools, where late position battle, getting close to 60%, early position battle, we're only getting like 50% folds when facing a raise. So everything is kind of close, but you can see it's right around the auto profit threshold, where the best spots, you might have plus EV bluff raise. The worst spots, it's going to be minus EV if you try and bluff raise the river in this situation. Okay, let's think about 3-bet pots. If you guys have any questions, by the way, just type in the chat. So 3-bet pots doesn't have that unique spot. It doesn't have that unique big blind versus small blind situation. It's more of a smooth progression between the different positions. So obviously big blind versus button and small blind versus button are probably going to be the widest, generally speaking. And then get to the other end of the spectrum, it's going to be like big blind or small blind versus UTG open or versus an MP open. Those are going to be the slightly less bluffed lines. However, even if we take one of those earlier position formations, for example, BB 3-bets against our MP open, something like that, we should be quite reluctant to fold top hat top kicker on the river. Now, we don't want to make this more complex than it needs to be. We don't often have a very wide calling range in this spot. Very often we're going to end up having something like ace king or ace queen anyway. But basic idea here is if we open raise UTG and we face a 3-bet and we flop something like ace king on a king high texture, so top hat top kicker, or ace queen on a queen high texture, something like that, we should be very reluctant to fold to the triple barrel. Yes, villain will have things like kings and aces. Yes, we will in fact be an underdog when facing the triple barrel. So if you open raise ace queen, big blind 3-bets, and board texture comes queen 7-2, we're in early position facing a big blind 3-bet, and villain triple barrels on a blank run out, we're not going to be a favorite facing the third barrel. We're going to be an underdog. We're going to lose most of the time in that spot. But we obviously get pot odds, and the data just doesn't support the profitability of falling hands this strong. So flop top head up kicker, we're really looking for excuses to not fall against a triple barrel. That's early position. When we start looking at some of these later position formations, we actually need to seriously consider calling down with weaker pairs. Now, we mentioned earlier, like easy versus difficult versions of poker. This is something that's going to be very good for your red line. It's going to improve your play in the sense that you're going to be much tougher to play against, but it's also going to tax your mindset further. And that's why everyone's kind of encouraged to find that sweet spot. The games are not so tough that I can't just get away with overfolding on every river and still expect to be a big winner. Like, the games haven't reached that stage right now. Okay, I can literally jump into the majority of games and I could just defend 2-pair plus facing the river triple barrel, and I'm reasonably competent or confident that I could still be a big winner in a lot of games. There's going to be some guys that are going to exploit that and say, hey, look, this guy folds 60% of the time to river triple barrel, let's just triple barrel bluff all the time. But I'm pretty sure that if you did that, you could be a big winner. All right, this is not hugely important in that sense. But it's not the highest EV line. Like, highest EV line is to bluff catch a bit closer to the line, and we're going to have things like top pair weak kicker in the range of hands that cools down against triple barrel. Now, the drawback to pushing it right up to the line and routinely calling down with weak top pairs is that even if it ends up being plus EV, it's going to be tough on your mindset. You need to have your mindset set up really well so that you're not going on tilt, because eventually you're going to lose like 10 of these in a row and you're going to be telling yourself, well, why do I always lose in 3-bet pots? Like, what's wrong with the game? Why is it rigged? Whatever players tell themselves when they hit a bad run. Okay, so it could be there's some sweet spot in the middle where your mindset's okay with it, but you're also not just playing that really, really tight bluff catching strategy. So I kind of advocate this approach in a lot of spots, and this is why I personally don't bluff catch right up to the line. It's going to be a lot of minus or a lot of very, very close bluff catching spots that don't really change our EV that much, but are heavily taxing on our mindset. Hopefully you can see why that's not great for us. You know, if someone just stopped me mid-session and said, hey, you know what, I'm going to give you this big blind for free, but you have to play the rest of the session with a terrible mindset on tilt. Am I going to take that big blind and say, yeah, sure, like, you know, it's plus EV for me to take your big blind. I don't care if I'm going to be playing my E game for the rest of the session. No, I'm not going to do that. You can keep your big blind. I'm technically doing something that's minus EV. I'll let you keep your big blind, even though you wanted to give it to me for free. But my mindset's going to be good for the rest of the session, and that's going to translate into EV for me. So we also want to be careful about thinking of poker as this static thing where every hand is played in a vacuum. We're not robots, we're humans, and certain things we do now are going to affect our EV in the future in terms of mindset. So you don't want to be too much of a purist in terms of, well, you should have punted off your stack here because the EV is, you know, 0.001 BB higher, so you've therefore made a mistake. You know, there's a balance here, and that balance point is going to be dependent on the strength of your mindset. So it's going to be different for the different players here watching this right now. Okay, so in terms of variables, they're very similar. In terms of calling range, they're very similar. Okay, so this is not like the BB versus SB spot. We're probably not going to be calling down with second pair type hands, but there are going to be situations where we open raise the button, big blind 3-bets us. There's no high card on the texture. All right, so this is something we've always mentioned when we're talking about 3-bet pots. High cards on the flop texture, same as it was in single raise pots. If there's an ace or a king out there after we call a 3-bet, that's bad for us. If it's a queen or a jack, it's probably like kind of neutral, maybe slightly good for us. You know, maybe jack's slightly good for us and queen's neutral, something like that. 10 high, 9 high, 8 high, these are all very good texture for us as the defender. So we know that we're going to be able to cool down a triple barrel wider in those kind of spots. But you know, for something like top pair with a jack or a queen, something like that, even if our kicker's not great, we very likely want to be seriously considering calling down a triple barrel unimproved, especially if everything bricks, especially if our opponent is a pink or green tag, especially if our opponent is using some kind of half pot sizing on the river, rather than sizing up beyond that 80% threshold. Alright, I think that's pretty much it. I don't have anything else to add for defending against triple barrels in position. Do you guys have any questions? Alright, let's call that session.